Hello and welcome to this review of the Commodore 64. Well, the keyboard at least. This was a donation. In fact, it was so highly requested that several people have offered to donate one by now. And here it is, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. The Commodore 64 was released in August of 1982 as its successor to the almost identical looking VIC-20. It utterly dominated the home computer market for years and sold well over 10 million units, making it the best-selling single computer system of all time. Not to be confused with 64-bit systems like the Nintendo 64, the Commodore gets its name from the 64K of RAM it had. It was actually an 8-bit computer. It was the victor of the home computer wars, which involved the Apple II, Tandy TRS-80, several Ataris, and above all its arch-rival, the TI-99-4A, whose manufacturer Texas Instruments nearly destroyed Commodore years earlier by outmaneuvering them in the calculator industry. The two got into a legendary price war so brutal and vicious that Texas Instruments were forced to sell their system below cost price to be able to shift any units whatsoever, while the Commodore was raking in more and more sales by the day, eventually outselling all their competitors combined. TI were eventually selling the 99-4A so cheaply at less than a fifth of its original price that retailers and consumers thought that there had to be something wrong with it, despite actually being relatively expensive to manufacture. Many retailers themselves further slashed the price in half from that point on as well. Jack Tramiel, Commodore CEO and an Auschwitz survivor of Polish-Jewish descent who had moved from the US to Canada in order to expand his business, decided in advance to wage war on highly aggressive pricing, or in his words, to be the Japanese, and so the Commodore 64 was designed right from the start to be technically capable yet extremely cheap to manufacture, making use of vertical integration. As a result, it could be sold at a price so competitive that review articles from the time basically hailed it as a no-brainer. It started at just under $600 and dropped to just $400 mere months later before going down in price even further, all the while still making a profit at rock-bottom prices, while Texas Instruments were losing $100 million a quarter. It was a bloodbath. The C64 and the home computer market eventually gave way to the sheer might of the IBM PC compatibles, whose by then industry standards, soft and hardware, had finally become affordable enough to open up to the mass market, but the Commodore 64's record-breaking sales stand as a testament to Tramiel's tremendous triumph. That said, even Commodore had to incur enormous costs to accommodate the huge expansion necessary to achieve the mass production, and Tramiel left the company in 1984 after a bitter disagreement with the chairman of the board, Irving Gould. So, keeping in mind it was so cheap, what did you get for your money? Well, the keyboard uses a type of Mitsumi hybrid switches, which is cool because that means I finally get to talk about these. They came in several variants, and this is one of the linear types. The switches are named hybrid switches because they're somewhere between a rubber dome/membrane keyboard and a mechanical one. See my recent video on what mechanical actually means, and all in all it's a pretty weird design. Mitsumi hybrid switches were sometimes used for other home computers as well, such as the VIC-20, Atari 800, Amiga, and occasionally even the TI-99-4A. The most well-known version of Mitsumi Hybrid is probably the KPQ type, which is a very unusual single-membrane conductive slider design with buckling rubber sleeves, which I'll cover in a later review down the line. The Commodore switches, while related, are quite different in execution though. First of all, it uses external coil springs, unlike the rubber sleeves of KPQ switches, which means that this switch is linear rather than tactile. Second, as you can see, it uses a PCB as backing, while KPQ-type switches used a single membrane instead. In both cases, the conductive foot on the slider would bridge these gaps and close a circuit. Now, this linear PCB-backed variant of Mitsumi hybrid switches is known as Type KKR. The variant that employs a membrane rather than a PCB is Type KPR. There's a little sticker on the PCB with a logo on it. From what I understood, that's Japanese for Mitsumi, and it adorns some of their old switches as well. Since 2017, Mitsumi is part of Minibear, also known as NMB, who were a very large player in keyboard land themselves during the 80s and 90s. You'll also note that there is a cutout in the PCB with an actual switch soldered in, again with the Mitsumi logo on it. This is for the shift lock key, which is a latching switch, i.e. when you press it, it stays down, and if you press it again, it pops back up. This was fairly common for old boards, but at the time, they apparently didn't have a locking membrane switch yet. They did later though, and this is what they look like. This is the caps lock switch from an Apple II keyboard, which often also came with Mitsumi hybrid switches. This one has a conductive foot integrated into the switch. I found that linear Mitsumi switches vary rather widely in specs and key feel. I've seen multiple boards using these switches, which ranged from stiff and scratchy to, for example, this KKR one, which, although dirty, is very light and extremely smooth. The Commodore switches are closer to the stiff and scratchy variant. It's not very good, but neither is it ultra terror, especially when you compare it to the switches some of its competitors used. For example, the Stackpole-made version of the TI-99-4A, which is such a fucking monstrous atrocity that I honestly think whatever arse biscuit-eating dick nugget came up with it owes everybody who ever used one a serious apology. Worse, in the meantime, the Brits had to make do with the ZX Spectrum, which I hope to show you one day as well. Compared to its infamously shit keyboard, which I've been told many times is Hall of Fame worthy, the Commodore's is quite decent, I suspect, although I don't have a ZX to compare it to at the moment. Common to KKR boards is a strange sensation just before bottoming out. Right before the end, the spring puts up quite a bit of resistance, which gives the key feel a rather unique twist to it. It's almost as if it's really, really mushy without being mushy, if that makes any sense. I mean, there's no rubber in there, but it feels like the last bit is made up of chewing gum or something. The unit weighs 1.9 kilos, which is pretty heavy, but it should be remembered that this is a whole computer, not just a keyboard, so comparing weights to get an indication of build quality isn't going to be very useful here. It has a decent case, and the internals have a metal cover over them though, so it seems pretty okay. The keyboard assembly itself weighs less than 500 grams though. At the back we have a whole bunch of ports, including an RF, video and serial port, a slot for a cassette deck and a second one for different units, I guess, as well as an expansion port. Cassettes were a common medium for Commodore 64 users. This went as far as certain radio stations actually broadcasting computer games which you were supposed to record on a cassette, and then the Commodore could read the radio data and play it, which to me is just mind-blowing, gives a whole different meaning to a pirate broadcast. The keycaps are big, high-profile ABS, with spherical tops, pad-printed lettering, and the cross-mount that's two-way incompatible with Cherry MX. The C64 is probably most well known for its incarnation with black keycaps, but this one uses white ones instead. I'm not sure if there's a difference in the exact model, or whether this was just a color option. The caps use a font I've never seen before, but it looks pretty cool. There are also all kinds of sub-legends with partly colored blocks, which I'm guessing was for drawing symbol-based graphics such as lines, boxes, etc. They look pretty cool, but pad printing is one of the cheapest and worst printing methods around, so I'm pretty sure they're not very durable. It's also got what appears to be the worst nav in history, just two buttons, a vertical one and a horizontal one. If you really had to use it with shift or control or something to pick between up and down, for example, I pity the poor souls who had to use it. Overall, when you compare it to the Model F XT keyboard that the IBM PC came with, the story gets pretty one-sided, as the Model F massively outclasses this thing in every single keyboard way, with stellar build quality, fantastic keycaps, and one of the best feeling switches to ever grace a keyboard. That said, as a Model F cost about $600 in 1981, which is the same as the entire Commodore before it even started the discounts, a significant difference in quality is to be expected, I guess. Basically, it's no contest for a reason. It's like comparing a grape to a bottle of wine. I don't have a way to get this running, and to be honest, even if I did, I have no childhood experiences with it, so it'd be strange and unfamiliar to me. I always had IBMs as a kid instead. But that said, this is a really interesting piece of computing history and a classic keyboard, so I'm quite happy with it. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.